Two of the cases that we looked at in more detail were Manus Island and Moria camp in Lesvos. Both are examples of where abuses were widespread. These case studies were great examples to study the roots and why human rights abuses occur. Moria camp was Greece's largest refugee camp, housing approximately 20,000 migrants, even though it was intended originally for 2,800. In this camp, an interviewee shared that PSC guards were stripping migrants naked and beating them. The camp burned down in 2020 and is no longer in operation, but operations continue on Lesvos and other camps. Manus Island, on the other hand, was a detention center established as an offshore processing center for asylum seekers by the Australian government in cooperation with the government of Papua New Guinea. Several PSCs were contracted to operate in the center throughout its years of existence. There were riots that occurred within the camp due to poor living conditions and severe mental health issues that existed. The center on Manus Island is no longer operating the capacity it once was. But these are not the only two cases that we looked at. We just looked at these two cases particularly because of the information that was available and looked at many other cases as well. Okay. The project was done through the Applied Research Project at the Graduate Institute in cooperation with ICoCA. We began by writing an inception report in July, which included a literature review analyzing all that has been found so far by researchers. We have conducted 18 qualitative interviews from July until November, with interviewees coming from backgrounds in academia, PSCs, NGOs, as well as one former detainee. One thing that we have seen is that human rights abuses may be prevalent among certain groups who are perceived to be vulnerable. Some of the main issues in vulnerability reported to us from interviewees and our analysis of the literature and news reports were the additional risk of abuses of members of the following groups, as you can see behind me. Many of the vulnerabilities and risks of abuses in these centers for these groups come from perceptions of masculinity, a climate of gender-based violence, and lack of training. But this is not to say that only these individuals are at risk of abuse. Many interviewees shared that the migrants in these contexts are already vulnerable and at risk of additional abuse. But throughout our interviews, these groups were mentioned frequently. As Matthew mentioned, there are hygienic issues in many of the camps. Regarding women, this makes them more vulnerable in these situations. There was safety regarding the restrooms in Moria camp in Lesvos, because women were often scared to use the restrooms due to a lack of lighting, as well as the climate of gender-based violence that existed. There was also a lack of access to medical care, including prenatal care, and lack of access to menstrual health products. We could see this in the centers in Portugal and Greece, as women were not able to receive proper care for their pregnancy-related issues, and in Moria camp, menstrual products were not accessible. Gender-based violence occurring in these camps were continuing to occur, and there was no mechanism to report it. It was reported that in Moria camp in Lesvos, the gender-based violence cases that were reported were often dismissed by camp authority. Many of our interviewees suggest that it was time for women to guard other women due to perceptions of masculinity as well as the climate of gender-based violence that exists. Children, on the other hand, are often unaccompanied and therefore they don't have a guardian in that case. So there are issues regarding their care as many personnel are not trained in providing child care. This often leads to abuse and the neglect of children. The LGBTQI community, on the other hand, is at risk for not conforming with heterosexual norms. This is often related to issues surrounding perceptions of masculinity and power imbalances that are heightened in these contexts. An interviewee shared that in Venezuela, there is a gap in government protections for individuals that are part of this community. Mental health is also an issue in these camps because there are a lack of resources. It's important to remember that the people being detained are often coming from traumatic backgrounds and need care. Based on 2 of our interviews, numerous detainees suffered from PTSD on Manus Island, and several even attempted suicide. We heard that in many cases, there is a lack of training of guards in responding to mental health crises. The final group that faces vulnerability is single young men. We heard in 3 of our interviews that single young men are a group that endure additional human rights abuses, specifically physical abuse. They are often cited as an overlooked group as they are typically not viewed as a group that is vulnerable by those managing the camps. They're at risk of physical abuse and getting beaten up with no accountability of the perpetrator. In Moria camp, an interviewee that was an NGO worker shared that men often got beaten up and kicked in the head for doing nothing wrong simply because they are viewed as problem-causing. Given the issues, the interviews highlighted certain ways to mitigate the human rights abuses that occur. There is a lack of accountability and reporting mechanisms that is prevalent in many of these cases and instances of physical abuse and gender-based violence. There is also a lack of training that is occurring. That includes cultural training and sensitivity training. But at the same time, there need to be the appropriate professionals for handling these issues on the ground. There needs to be more women employed in these contexts, as well as childcare professionals, doctors, and mental health professionals. The heightened perceptions of masculinity combined with the power imbalances that exist also attribute to the human rights abuses that are occurring. An overarching theme that we saw throughout all of the interviews was that context matters. Specific situations and routes demand specific needs and best practice. To optimize for a pragmatic approach that addresses context-specific needs, but at the same time creates universal best practices, we use the framework of different migration routes focusing on 3: maritime routes, drug routes, and conflict routes. Although this list is by no means exhaustive and routes can overlap, understanding the distinct needs of each characteristic is fundamental to proper planning, which we found was an instrumental area for mitigating human rights abuses. Promoting human rights starts at proper planning and creating a comprehensive needs assessment.
Right. So the most important assets for a private security company in many ways is its employees. It's its human capital. That means that starting with the planning, one of the most fundamental areas that either promote or mitigate abuses is through employee management. Starting from planning insofar as vetting and recruitment, this is one of the key areas where this could either be seen as a driver of abuse or an area where you can sort of mitigate abuse. When you're looking at vetting specifically, you want to get vets. You want to vet for people that are particular to the skills needed for that particular context. So, as my colleague has highlighted, we have routes that are either infused with drug routes, or they're dealing with more refugees coming from crisis countries, or maritime routes. This means that you have to balance between soft and hard skills. Hard skills being those tactical skills such as use of force or operating a specific weapon or even operating a ship. And soft skills are those things that are less trainable but still extremely important, especially in the context of migration overall, such as communication skills and emotional intelligence, detecting mental health issues, for instance. So balancing those out at the vetting stage is extremely important and was one of the reasons why the imbalance of that was one of the reasons why much abuse was reported. In particular, you can look at the case of ex-military and former police officers who were said to be recruited at a higher level than most into these private security contracts. And you can see that for them, there is a sort of imbalance between hard skills and soft skills, where ex-military in particular have more tactical training, but they lack sometimes that communication skills, which is not as useful in the migration context. Of course, for certain routes, such as drug routes, it does become more important. But in the general scheme of migration routes, this imbalance can really become a problem. Someone that is trained for combat or for dealing with combatants on a battlefield is not necessarily the exact set of skills to match the demand for people dealing with people in vulnerable situations. Another area that we saw that is a potential driver of abuse in employee management is simply that guards are given too much responsibility. And this is a function of a state demand, which I'll come to later. But not only are they given too much responsibility or too many different services that they have to apply, sometimes these conflict. One poignant example of this given by one of the interviewees is where vulnerable people sometimes had to approach the guards that they were abused. Oh, for the interpreters? Absolutely, of course. So one of the poignant examples for this was where someone who was abused had to go to the guards to seek medical attention. And that means that the guard who is potentially the source of abuse is also the person that they are seeking the remedy from. And that, of course, creates a conflict of interest and is a problem for the detainee. Another area that is extremely important in terms of employee management is with working conditions. So I'm going to quote from one of the interviewees directly here, and I'm going to start quote, "If your employees are in miserable positions, they will have little to no incentive to make sure that migrants he manages are in better conditions than they are in. In fact, they will most likely take it out on the migrants." So what does that mean? This shows this dynamic pretty clearly, where if an employee doesn't have the right skills, doesn't have the right tools, doesn't have the right mental health supports, they're going to be frustrated in their environment, and it's already a tense environment, and this may be taken out on the detainees making the situation even worse. There was also an interesting example given by one of the interviewees in Peru, where there's something related to wearing the right uniform and the pride in the uniform. So in Peru, the low-level sort of surveillance guards that have lower training, less career prospects, and lower wages have to wear this brown uniform to distinguish them from the official uniforms of police. Now, this uniform over time became associated with those low working conditions, and that means that the employees themselves weren't per se as apt to follow the highest standards and promote the best practices because they simply had no respect for the job or the position that they were in. Moving on to another very critical aspect of employee management, and it has been sort of a catch-all phrase for the problems of for some of the stated problems that happen in migrant detention centers, was the general lack of training. Over three-fourths of our interviewees mentioned that lack of training is sort of the main issue for why these abuses occur. But what does that actually mean? So it was cited that training often happens at the recruitment process or right after the start of a contract, and it's done for a few weeks in the beginning as a one-time thing with limited follow-up and not recurrent training. It is also very much generalized. For instance, they also talk about how the use of force training and tactical training is often over-prioritized as compared to cultural awareness, as my colleague mentioned, or mental health detection. So these are the distinctions between soft and hard skills, which are critical to get the balance correct. Also, at an administrative level, there is the problem of understanding your employees. And of course, this ties back to training, because if you can understand what the deficits in skills and the skill gaps that are needed to address, then you can tailor the training to be specific to that employee and to the position that he is meant to fulfill. And here I want to quote another interviewee that we had who said, "Too often, employees are trained in how to operate a weapon or what to do in an emergency, but are not trained on basic communication skills, which are integral to the job." This again shows that lack of balance between soft and hard skills. Moving away from employee management and into structural drivers of abuse, we've noticed at least three. Of course, there are probably more. One of the main ones was the insufficient transparency, lack of accountability structures and monitoring and oversight. Civil society organizations mentioned having limited access to camps and to detention centers, and even when they did, it usually was just in the visitation area, so that it really didn't help produce that trust in the community and the system as was hoped. There was also a cited lack of standard operating procedures for incidents and for reporting, and this meant that there wasn't enough follow-up and enough systems learning to really evolve and learn from your mistakes, for employees to learn from their mistakes. On the topic of complaint mechanisms, there was definitely sightings of people talking about how there are drop-off boxes for written notes of complaints reviewed by independent bodies. However, they didn't often account for some of the accessibility problems that may occur. For instance, many of the detainees simply did not have the same language that were on the forms that were meant to be signed for the complaints. Also, there were some people that were simply illiterate, so accounting for these was another problem. A second structural problem was downward government pressure on the market itself. So governments sometimes are simply trying to demand too many services from private security companies, while at the same time trying to cut costs. This means that human rights standards are often relegated, that there is lack of due diligence, and overall in the industry, this leads to a sort of race to the bottom scenario where companies are vying for lower standard contracts, cutting costs, and this, of course, means worse standards overall. Finally, another structural problem that was, of course, very important, and it's very contextual to the migration issue, is the extraterritorialization of borders. So this means that you're operating in between jurisdictions. There is a kind of gray zone. Some interviewees described it as a vacuum of legislation, and overall, this makes accountability very complex. You have lack of judicial proceedings that occur because of this. You have little access to remedy for the detainees, or at least a perceived sort of ambiguity about what their options are in a legal sense. Finally, the report wouldn't be complete without mentioning some of the technologies which my colleague Matthew mentioned in the beginning as well. Drones, cameras, electronic tags, smart prisons, facial recognition, phone tracking, these are all cited examples of technologies that are being used and with increasing frequency. This does come with its own set of problems. In particular, we can talk about data protection, where there are certain restrictions in terms of how the data can be processed, the use of drones, for instance, in mass casualty situations, and the hiding of identities. It's also a big problem connected to the idea of government pressure. So the government is demanding these services in this zone of ambiguity in terms of legislation, but at the same time, the PSCs are trying to supply these services, and there isn't really a squaring of whether the legislation is applicable here. And this leads, of course, to the potential of abuse. Another thing that we mentioned, that we saw, though, when we're talking about technology, although there was, I would say, an overt pessimism in our interviewees about the use of technology, there was some silver linings. So in particular, a good example was using technology for faster administrative processing, which leads to less overcrowding in detention centers because you have less people in so-called administrative limbo. You also have a case where people were using RFID tags within a detention center so that they knew which facilities were being more used and which were being less, and that allows you to do better facilities training, or facilities planning, which helps mitigate some abuses. Facility design on that topic was very important as well. So there is a general trend of using former prisons as a detention center, and of course this can either aggravate or mitigate abuses. And one way, of course, migrants are not people that have committed crimes. So treating them in these detention facilities that are used to be former prisons, especially if they're families, can be very problematic. They do, however, there is something that we can learn, as prisons have a lot of development on protection against self-harm, which is one of the issues that we've recited. And so even if when we're applying to ad hoc camps, for instance, applying some of these lessons on how to prevent self-harm is an important lesson here. On the topic of ad hoc camps in particular, of course, these are very problematic because they're meant to be temporary. They're makeshift camps in many cases. They lack facilities and there's overcrowding. But the reality is that they have become permanent in many cases, or semi-permanent. And of course, this is simply not adequate. So overall, the last slide on learning points. What can we learn from this? I think one of the most important quotes that we got here, which is a reality, unfortunately, of the situation is, and I'll quote, "If you want to see how to improve conditions inside migration detention centers, you often just have to look at the criminal justice system." It means that the criminal justice system sometimes has better accountability structures, it does not temporary, so it has better facilities, and it has overall a better trust in terms of protecting human rights than some of these ad hoc centers for sure, and even than some migrant detention centers. This led us to look a little bit into the fields of alternative to detentions, which is something that was mentioned by not just handbooks, but also by some of the interviewees. And these can actually be seen as being cheaper and cost-effective, while at the same time producing better results in terms of protecting human rights. There is still a need for PSCs in this realm, and this area certainly needs to be explored further, but they by no means replace the need of PSCs in the industry. One thing that I do want to say on this topic, though, is that there is an expressed concern that sometimes alternative to detentions, the discourse has been going towards becoming alternative forms of detention. So this means that you're still severely, restricting privacy or restricting freedom of movement, but you don't have any legal justification for that. And that, of course, is a problem. So the main message is that migrants are not people who have committed crimes. They are not out on parole. And in terms of alternatives to detention, we need to consider that. So that's what we have presented here so far for the working group. And in our full reports, we go a little bit deeper into the recommendations. But for now, I think we're going to leave you with that so that we can sort of discuss. And I'll hand over the floor to Vincent. Thank you.